In early 1997, Tim Humphreys and his brother Mike purchased a 30-acre piece of land in the vast, remote wilderness of Oklahoma, seeking peace far from the fast life of bustling cities. But soon after their arrival, things took a very terrifying turn. Their nights were filled with strange sounds. And one night, a scream so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of their home. At first, they tried to dismiss it as the sounds of the wilderness. Soon, they began to feel eyes watching them and massive shapes barely visible through the trees, stalking their every move. Then, the stalking turned into something far worse. The family wasn't just being observed, they were being hunted. And soon, their home fell under an unrelenting and terrifying siege. What started as a dream quickly spiraled into a nightmare. This is the true story of the Siege at Honobia, an event so terrifying it left Bigfoot enthusiasts and skeptics alike questioning everything they thought they knew. Tim and Mike had been searching for the perfect piece of land for months, a place where they could settle down, hunt, and live surrounded by the wilderness. It was Mike who found the property, a secluded stretch of forested land about an hour's drive from where he currently lived. The moment he mentioned it to Tim, his brother's excitement was palpable. A cabin, acres of untouched forest, and an abundance of game to hunt. It was everything they had ever wanted, and without hesitation, they moved forward with the purchase. Because Mike lived closer, Tim leaned on him to scope out the property before the sale was final. Over the next few days, Mike visited at different times. Early morning when the mist lay low over the grass, at midday when the sun filtered through the treetops, and late afternoon when the light stretched long and golden across the land. The goal was to get a feel for the area, find out where the deer trails ran, and where the best hunting spots would be. Both brothers lived for the hunt, and this land had the potential to be their own private paradise. It was on one of those late afternoon visits, at the end of a long work week, that something unsettled Mike. He had been making his usual rounds, weaving through the trees just beyond the clearing where the cabin stood, scanning the ground for tracks. The forest was alive with the distant rustling of small creatures, the occasional chirp of birds settling in for the night. But as the sun dipped lower, a stillness fell over the woods. Something made him stop. He couldn't say why at first. It was just a feeling, an unease crawling up his spine, prickling the back of his neck. Then he saw it. At the edge of the tree line, standing just beyond where the light could fully reach, was a figure. Massive, motionless, a hulking shadow leaning against the darkened trunks. Mike narrowed his eyes, his pulse quickening. The mind could play tricks at dusk. Of course, he knew that. Shadows stretched and shifted as the sun sank. Branches twisted into shapes they weren't. And yet, still, something about it felt off. A slow, creeping chill spread through his chest. He suddenly felt vulnerable and exposed. Normally, when he was out in the woods, he had his rifle slung over his shoulder, partly out of habit, partly for safety, but this was just a surveying trip. He wasn't hunting, and his rifle, well, that was locked away, back at his truck. He stayed still for a moment, watching, waiting for the figure to dissolve into nothing. Just a trick of light, an illusion his tired mind had conjured after a long week. But it didn't. If anything, it seemed to be watching him. A cold prickle ran through his skin, but he forced himself to turn away, shaking his head at his own paranoia. When he steadied himself and looked back toward the spot where the figure had stood, it was gone. A quiet breath escaped him, tension easing from his chest like a weight being lifted. He let out a small, uneasy chuckle, feeling foolish for letting his mind get the better of him. He knew that if he told Tim, he would never let him hear the end of it. They had always been close, always playing pranks, always looking for an excuse to get one over on each other. If Mike admitted that a shadow in the woods had rattled him, Tim would never let him live it down. As he walked back to his truck, he convinced himself that it was nothing. A few weeks after purchasing the property, Tim, his wife, and their 2 kids settled into their new life in the wilderness, eager to embrace the change. It was everything they had imagined: peaceful, untouched, and a world away from the noise, pollution, and confinement of city life. The land stretched out before them, wild and full of promise. Towering pines swayed gently in the wind, their scent mingling with the crisp woodland air. The only sounds were the rustling leaves, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot, and the distant calls of birds. Here, surrounded by nature, they felt free. And Mike, too, had decided to move in with his brother and his family, eager to join them in their new adventure. The first few days felt like heaven. Each morning, they explored the property, following winding deer trails, tracing the edges of the dense tree line, and soaking in the vastness of the land they now called home. Every moment was filled with excitement, a deep satisfaction that they had made the right choice. Thoughts of what they could build, where they would set up blinds for hunting, how they would shape their future here. It all filled them with a quiet thrill. A few days later, the time had come for their first hunt. From the moment they arrived, they had noticed just how much wildlife thrived in the area. Deer trails crisscrossed the land in nearly every direction, almost too many to count. It was a hunter's dream. The day was long and eventful, and by the time they returned home with their kill, exhaustion was met with satisfaction. That night, they cooked the fresh venison, filling the house with the rich aroma of seared meat and wood smoke. They ate well, their new home already proving to be everything they had hoped for. Later in the evening, after dinner had been cleared and the warmth of the fire lingered in the cabin, the brothers stepped outside. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. They sat on the porch, stretching out the quiet moments of the night, letting themselves fully sink into the peace they had found here. The stars stretched endlessly overhead, undisturbed by city lights, and the land around them felt calm and settled. But then, something startled them. It was distant at first, just on the edge of hearing perception, a noise carried on the wind, almost barely there. But then it grew, a scream, a long, wavering shrill. It came from deep within the woods, stretching out over the trees, rising and falling in unnatural tones. The usual chorus of insects had fallen silent. The trees, once swaying gently, now stood still. The air around them felt suddenly heavier and thick with something unseen. Neither of them moved for a moment. By now, the sound had come and gone, but the unease it left behind lingered. Both looked at each other to register if the other had heard it. No words were spoken, but their eyes had mostly confirmed it. Quickly, they turned and stepped inside, shutting the door behind them. Not to worry the wives, the brothers spoke nothing of what they heard and got ready to turn in for the night. But little did they know, this was just the very beginning of what was to come. Some weeks had passed, and for the brothers and their wives, life on the property had settled into a steady rhythm. Days were spent working the land and hunting, while nights carried strange, distant sounds, unsettling at first, but soon just another part of the wilderness that they learned to ignore. Until one night. Sometime after midnight, something shattered the routine, something they could not ignore. A long bellow, deep, guttural, and wild. It began as a low rumble, rolling through the trees, before erupting into a bone-rattling roar that shook the house. The windows trembled, the ground vibrated. It didn't stop. It lingered, stretching impossibly long, rising and falling in unnatural waves. Jolted awake, the brothers and their wives rushed to the windows, searching the darkness for whatever had unleashed the sound. They had dismissed the noises before, but not this time. This was something else, something that demanded their attention. They strained their eyes to see into the darkness, but they could not see anything. But as the hours passed and silence crept back in, exhaustion won over fear. One by one, they drifted back to sleep. As the first light crept through the trees, the brothers wasted no time. The scream from the night before still hung in their minds, and they needed answers. They grabbed their rifles and combed through the woods, searching for any sign of what had made that unearthly sound. They searched for tracks, broken branches, anything, but the forest gave them nothing. The trees stood undisturbed, the underbrush untouched. It was as if the night had swallowed every trace of what had happened. Back on the property, Tim's unease only deepened. Something was off. His eyes drifted to the shed, the one where he had strung up a deer carcass just the evening before, planning to butcher it in the morning. The door stood wide open, swaying slightly in the breeze. His stomach tightened. Stepping inside, he stopped cold. The deer was gone. Not butchered, not stolen, just gone. The rope that had held it lay discarded on the floor, frayed and snapped. Not cut, but torn, as if something had ripped the carcass away with sheer force. His pulse quickened. He turned, glancing toward the back of the shed, where their small flock of chickens had been housed. They were gone too. No feathers, no blood, no tracks leading away. Just an eerie, unnatural emptiness, as if they had never been there at all. Tim stood in the open doorway, gripping the frame as a slow, creeping dread settled in his gut. Predators were a reality out here, but this was not normal. Coyotes would have left a mess. A bear would have torn through the shed itself. But here, there was nothing. No sign of a struggle, and no evidence of anything at all. The land had felt like a dream when they first arrived. A sanctuary, a fresh start. Now, standing in the hushed morning air, staring into the void where his game should have been, a new thought took root. Maybe this place wasn't what he had made it out to be. Over the nights, 5 deer carcasses vanished from the shed without a trace, followed by the nightly disappearance of their chickens. Frustrated and increasingly uneasy, the brothers decided to take action, installing motion sensor lights in hopes of deterring the unseen intruder, or finally catching a glimpse of the culprit. Life had taken a strange turn for the Humphrey family. The once free and expansive aura of the land around their home now felt heavy, as though the very atmosphere had altered. The open, liberating space they had once cherished now seemed to shrink, closing in around them. Having recently installed motion lights and sensors in an attempt to protect themselves, things were only getting worse. The night bringing with it a terrifying new development. The family was suddenly jolted awake by loud, deliberate hammering, violent pounding echoing against the doors and walls of their home. The noise was relentless and terrifying. They rushed to the windows, hearts pounding in their chests, desperate to understand what was happening. The motion sensors outside flickered to life, casting beams of light across the yard, illuminating the landscape in an eerie glow. And what they saw sent a cold wave of terror through them. Within the tree line, 3 or 4 hulking shadows moved, large, distorted figures pacing back and forth. Their forms were barely discernible in the dim light, but their eyes glowed with an unsettling amber hue. The figures lingered just beyond the edge of the trees, watching the house, moving with a deliberate predatory intent. The family stood frozen, unable to look away as the creatures continued to pace, their glowing eyes locked on the house, unblinking. The pounding on the walls and doors suddenly stopped, and the shadowy figures sulked back into the night, leaving the family in stunned silence. Hearts still racing, they stood frozen, struggling to process what they had just witnessed. The terrifying scene, the pounding, the glowing eyes, replayed in their minds, leaving them with more questions than answers. But one thing was certain. They knew they were no longer safe. The following night, the assault grew worse. Large rocks pelted the house, shattering windows and rattling the walls. Each impact sent shockwaves of terror through the family. The nights were now filled with guttural screams, growing louder and more savage as time passed. The brothers, fully aware of the danger, armed themselves to the teeth. This wasn't a warning. It was a full-blown siege, and they were prisoners in their own home. One night, Tim's 3-year-old daughter screamed in terror, claiming a gorilla had been staring at her through the window. Days later, her mother saw it too, a massive hulking figure standing just outside, its glowing eyes watching them. That was the breaking point. Fearing for their lives, Tim sent his wife and kids to stay with relatives, leaving only him and his brother to face the creatures. The brothers now knew these were no longer just animals. They were too intelligent and coordinated to be just mere animals. The silence of the night was shattered when Tim spotted one of the creatures peering through the window. Without hesitation, he fired a volley of bullets from his rifle. The beast took the shots, stumbling back and hunching over, but others quickly dragged it into the woods. The retaliation was absolutely brutal. The creatures erupted from the woods, screaming like possessed beings, and hurled rocks at the house. The walls trembled with each hit, windows shattered in a storm of glass. The brothers fired back. They could hear the creatures circling the property, their heavy footsteps now closing in on the house. Then, a howl of pure rage pierced the night as the creatures tried to break through the walls. The brothers held their ground, but the assault never relented. The house shook with every impact, the walls groaning under the weight of the attack. Their ammunition began to run low, but they knew they couldn't stop. Luckily, the sun was about to rise, and by dawn, the attack subsided. The creatures retreated into the forest, leaving the house in ruins. Bloodied and breathless, the brothers knew it wasn't over. They had survived the night, but the creatures were still out there, hunting them. The true siege had begun, and there was no escaping it. For some reason, Tim had not contacted the authorities, but instead reached out to the Bigfoot Field Research Organization, BFRO. Perhaps by now, he knew the creatures they were dealing with weren't ordinary animals. Rumors swirled that people in these woods had little faith in the police for various reasons, making it easier to turn to experts who understood the unexplained. The BFRO sent 2 investigators, Miles, who worked for the BFRO, and Roger, a well-respected private investigator and Vietnam War veteran with military intelligence experience. Upon arriving, they interviewed the brothers, took photos of the area, and examined the rocks thrown at the house. After assessing the situation, they promised to return the next day to conduct further tests. But just 12 hours later, the investigators received a frantic call from the Humphreys. All they could hear on the other end was the chaotic sound of gunshots and men shouting. Finally, Mike managed to grab the phone and in a breathless voice quickly explained the scene. Roger, calm but urgent, instructed Mike and Tim to collect any evidence they could, possibly even a Bigfoot body, and said they would arrive first thing in the morning to gather whatever they could. When the investigators arrived the next day, they found no Bigfoot carcasses. The brothers had no physical evidence to offer. The men, though puzzled, decided to expand their search. They ventured around the area and spoke with some locals who had witnessed Bigfoot sightings during their hunts. These people pointed the investigators toward a cave they believed the creatures were using as a den. Hopeful, the team explored the cave, but what they found only raised more questions. The cave was far too small to accommodate a 7 to 8 foot creature. It was more of a small crevice than a proper dwelling, nothing like the lairs one would expect a creature of that immense size would use. With no clear evidence to follow, they decided to head back to base. The following night, the attacks continued. The creatures grew bolder, their screams more feral, and the rocks hurled at the house grew even larger. The pounding of their fists against the walls rattled the brothers to their core. Overwhelmed, terrified, and with ammunition running low, they made a fateful decision. At first light, they abandoned the property, leaving everything behind, from their furniture to the food still sitting in the fridge, never to return. In the days that followed, the BFRO interviewed the brothers in more detail, hoping to uncover any clue that might explain the escalating terror. But despite their efforts, the investigation stalled. No physical evidence could be found, and the case was eventually closed. To this day, Tim and Mike swear by what they experienced, their voices heavy with the weight of it all. They've since warned anyone thinking of moving to the woods to be prepared for the unimaginable. Mike's parting message remains chillingly simple. You have been warned.